If you're here and you can see us and hear us, welcome. You're very warmly welcome to this session on the Universal Periodic Review. I can't see you, unfortunately, but I wish that I could, and we were able to hold this event in person. Today we're going to look at Scotland's Human Rights Report Card, which is a process that we know in human rights terms as Universal Periodic Review. We are going to be talking a bit in detail about how people, rights holders and civil society can contribute to that process. We've got a really amazing lineup of speakers who know all about this and are going to be able to tell you about it. So we're looking forward to that. Before we do that, though, I just wanted to look at some housekeeping and some accessibility points as well, just so that we can make sure that everyone can get as much as possible out of today's event. So you'll see that your mic is off automatically, and you'll also see that, unlike in a Zoom meeting, we won't be able to see your video or anything like that. And that's just because we're using a webinar platform rather than a meeting platform. We will do a few polls in just a minute so that you can all kind of say hello and get to know who else is in the room. Just a few things to advise you of, really. So we are recording this session. And the reason that we're doing that is because we want to be able to share it for later for other organisations who maybe weren't able to kind of come along today, and we wanted them to be able to benefit from the information that we're going to hear about. Please don't be concerned about that. We will edit out anybody who hasn't provided their consent to be recorded. So we will do that after the fact, and don't let that stop you from participating as fully as you want to. On accessibility, I would like to introduce Elizabeth, who you can see, she's our BSL interpreter, and we also have Stephen here, and they'll be swapping between them. So that's them just saying hello to you now. On a laptop, if you are watching the BSL and you're using it, you can actually drag the windows out so they're a bit larger if you want to make that bigger. And on a phone or a tablet, you can also pinch out on the screen, so just so that they're a bit bigger and you can see them okay. We also have lovely Mel and Paula, who are our electronic note takers, and you'll see that they're providing a closed caption option today. So for anybody who wants to see subtitles, just to follow today's event, you can use that. So if you are joining us on a laptop, you can look at your Zoom menu along the bottom, and you should be able to click on CC closed caption, and that should pop up for you. If you're joining us on a phone or a tablet, again, if you just click on the More button, you'll be able to see closed caption and you can join in there. And that should just support anybody who needs to use those. One thing to say, we will be having regular kind of question breaks throughout the morning. We know that this is a slightly technical process, and people might have a lot of things to ask about it. So we will be stopping for various breaks to ask questions. You'll see at the bottom of your screens, whether you're on a phone or whether you're on a laptop, there's something called Q&A, a Q&A function. And essentially that enables you to type in a question early on, and we can look at it and have it answered. If you see a question in there that is very similar to something you'd like to ask, you can click on the kind of thumbs up little icon there, and that upvotes the question. So then we know that that's one that's really important to people and that they want to hear about. So do use that function. It saves you having to type out your own question all over again. So that's good. If you are using British Sign Language and you would like to ask a question during one of the question breaks, if you use the raise hand function, and my colleague Carolyn will be able to pop you on screen so that we can see your question, and the BSL interpreters can convey that to our speakers. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the shape of this morning, what it's going to look like and what we're going to do. So before our break at 11:30, we are going to look at basically what Universal Periodic Review is. What does it mean? How do we participate in it? And we're going to hear from two fantastic speakers. So our very own Diego at the Commission, who's our Policy and International Officer. So he's going to give you a little bit of an overview and some information about how we as the Scottish Human Rights Commission participate in that process. I'm really pleased also that we can welcome Nicoletta Zapile. She's from UPR Info, and she's going to be talking to us all about how we can participate in this process. So we're really pleased to have you, Nicoletta, and welcome. After our break, we'll have a 15-minute break or so. We are really lucky. We've got Helen Griffiths here from the Children and Young People's Commissioner. She is going to talk to us a little bit about her experiences of participating in the Universal Periodic Review. So that's going to be really interesting, and there'll be time for you to ask questions and find out more about that. And we're also going to hear from Mhairi Snowden, who many of you will know. She's in charge of the Human Rights Consortium Scotland, and she's going to be talking about a few different plans in relation to UPR. So that will be really interesting. So a lot to get through this morning, and hopefully it's going to be really good. One thing I wanted to just run through to start with is around some of the terminology around universal periodic review, because as we know, sometimes human rights and human rights law uses some quite complicated terms that we don't necessarily automatically know what they mean. So I just wanted to give you a few terms that you might hear throughout the morning and clarify what they are, just in case. So the first one is the Human Rights Council, and this is the body at the United Nations. It's made up of 47 different countries, and they're responsible for kind of protecting and promoting human rights. And they are basically in charge of running the Universal Periodic Review. So you might hear about them throughout the morning. Another little bit of acronym that you might hear is CSO, which stands for Civil Society Organisations. And that just really refers to the voluntary sector, the third sector. So if you hear that, that's what that means. And then also you may hear, obviously, UPR itself, that's Universal Periodic Review. We're going to hear all about that process throughout the whole morning. And that's really the process by which countries are judged on their human rights records by other countries. So there's just a few bits of terminology that might be useful for you to know. All right. So I know that you can't see each other and I can't see you, unfortunately, but hopefully we can kind of get to know a little bit about who is in this kind of Zoom webinar through some of our polls. So we have a poll functionality, which we're going to just do a little test run. So the first poll that we're going to look at is just how are you doing this morning? How are you feeling? And what I will do is see if I can launch that. So we're going to launch that, and hopefully that will pop up on your screen. So here we go. How are you doing this morning? Super, with an exclamation mark. So really super, good. With enough tea or coffee, things will improve. Well, I can see that one zooming ahead. I've been better, and I wish I was still in bed. So have a go at that and see how you're most feeling this morning. And that'll just give us a little practice session. Looks like most people have voted. I can see that you're very much an audience after my own heart, which is with enough tea or coffee, things will improve. That's how I feel most of the time. All right, fantastic. And Sophie has just popped up a message in the chat. Feel free to use the chat to communicate with each other as well. We'd really welcome that. So I'm going to end that poll. And what I will do is just start our second poll. And this is really just to find out what kind of organisations we have here in the room and the kind of areas that you work in. Now, I'm afraid we're a little bit limited on the options that we have. So we can only have 10 options, which obviously doesn't cover the kind of vast area of work that people are likely to do. So please do just try to choose the option which is most meaningful to you. And apologies if you don't really see directly what you work in. So I'll just pop that one up and launch it. So it says, please let us know which areas you work or volunteer in, and feel free to choose more than one. So we've got asylum, refugee and immigration issues, human rights for specific groups, so maybe children's rights you work in, or women's rights, or disabled people's rights, or rights for Black and minority ethnic communities, social care, education, environment and climate change, faith and belief. We have health and mental health, housing, justice and policing, poverty and social security. So do take a look at that and see where you feel like you fit the most. And I'll give you a bit of time to complete that polling. Oh, it looks like we've got a real mixture. You can't see the results yet, but I can just see it coming through. Not everybody's had the chance to vote. All right, I'm going to end that and just share the results. And apologies if you didn't quite get the chance to click on there. So we've got about 15% of the folk here working on asylum and refugee issues, Most people saying that they really identify strongly with doing human rights work and maybe for specific groups of people. So that's excellent. You will have lots of knowledge and expertise to share at the UPR. Brilliant. We've got some people working in social care, some in education, a few in environment and climate change, which is great with the COP26 coming up, some in faith and belief, health and mental health as well. We've got about just under half, housing, justice, poverty and social security. So a really, really wide range of issues and experience and knowledge in the room. So that is absolutely excellent. All right. So I just have one more poll for you to take a look at, which is really, how do you feel about the UPR now? How much do you know, just before we start the session off? And I will just launch that poll. So there's a few different options here. One is I'm an expert. The second one is I know a fair bit, but I need to find out more about this. I've heard of it, but not much more. And I've never heard of it. And all of those answers are absolutely fine. All right, I can see nearly everybody has voted. Let's have a look. So I'll just end that poll and share the results with you. Okay, so a couple of people, well, one person who's an expert, excellent. And then most people are thinking maybe, well, I've heard of it. I know that that's a thing, but I need to find out more about that. So you have come to the right place, people. That's excellent, because that's just what we're going to find out about today. Brilliant. All right. So without further ado, I am going to introduce Diego Quiroz. He is our Policy and International Officer at the Commission. There's pretty much nothing about the international human rights system that he doesn't know. So he's an excellent person to kind of start us off. And he also has a huge amount of policy expertise in a number of different areas. For example, criminal justice, the environment, and also business and human rights. So he's a good person to know if you work in any of those fields. And I'm going to pass over you to Diego to give us a bit of a lightning introduction into Universal Periodic Review and what it is.
Thank you, Chloe, and that's for that generous introduction. Welcome again, and thank you to thank you to UPR Info and Nicoletta for their usual support to us and Scotland on the UPR, and of course to Helen, who will share her experiences and not only at the Children Commission but at Human Rights Watch. So from an NGO perspective, it's very important to hear from her. So in the next 5 minutes, I will give you an overview of the UPR, including their goals and the importance of civil society participation and our role as a NHRI. So let me start with the UPR. So the UPR provides a new and exciting opportunity for civil society and practitioners to hold the UK and the Scottish government accountable for all his human rights obligations and commitments. So the UPR is a mechanism created by the Human Rights Council in response to criticism to previous UN process focused too much on certain regions and countries. So the UPR is designed to be applied more universally and uniformly. By the way, the Human Rights Council adopted a model created by the African Union, which is very interesting. The UPR is similar to other human rights and mechanisms as encourages civil society participation and to engage in the dialogue within the process and to encourage the governments to respect, protect, and fulfill their obligations. There are two important differences with other human rights accountability process, particularly if we talk about treaty reviews. One is that the UPR is a peer review model, which makes it political, which has pros and cons, and we will discuss that. And two, the UPR covers the broad range of human rights. So we are talking here about the whole body of international law and agreements, rather than only the human rights treaties that the UK has signed. And as you know, there are 7 of them. So in terms of the purpose of the UPR, I see 3 clear drivers. The first one is to advance the human rights situations for all. So here is the importance of diverse civil society participation in the process, and it is clearly represented today and by the survey that we just seen. The second one is pushing governments to fulfill their human rights obligations and commitments. The third one is sharing best practices between the countries and stakeholders. I think that's a very important one, and we have done that, for example, on incorporation of human rights treaties and climate justice. Now, in terms of participation of civil society, well, participation of civil society is key and is a fundamental element of the process to inform the process and to improve the quality of the review. Civil society participation has been very effective, and Nicoletta will talk more about that. It can take different shapes and forms depending on the capacity and expertise of your organizations. This can be anything from submitting a report, engaging with the Scottish government, to lobbying the countries that participate in the UK review and ensuring implementation of the UPR recommendations after they are adopted. As you probably know, the UK was assessed for the third time under the UPR in 2017, and we're currently preparing for the next review in 2022, so next year. As the NHRI for Scotland, we submitted a report to the UN outlining the major issues facing Scotland in 2016. Our report set around 24 priorities, recommendations for actions, both for the Human Rights Council, but also for the Scottish Government, many of which were voiced by member states of the Human Rights Council and are reflected in the UPR recommendations. You can see our report and the lobbying briefing papers that we prepare in our website. Now, the 2017 process was finalized with around 227 recommendations to the UK, and the UK government has accepted just 42% of those recommendations. It said that in January of this year, the UK published an update to this, and the Scottish government has contributed to that update. We are currently analyzing that response. In terms of the role of the NHRIs, together with the Equality and Human Rights Commission and the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commissions, we make up the 3 UK NHRIs. And we coordinate our engagement to the UPR quite closely and find, So strategically, it is very important for us to participate in this process where government is held accountable for their human rights obligations, and the UPR is one of those processes. As the NHRI for Scotland, we produce a report, as mentioned to you, and engage in the whole process that we will see the different stages. And it is crucial for us also to support civil society participation. And we want to share our experiences on the UPR and encourage you to strategically engage with the UPR process. So finally, this is one of a series of UPR workshops that will be running this year. And at the end of the meeting, we will discuss our next session on the 12th of May on the preparation of the UPR submission and our plans for civil society engagement. So I just stop here. I want to thank you again and looking forward to have a productive discussion. Thank you, Chloë.
Thank you so much, Diego. That was great. Managed to summarize an awful lot of information there for us in a very short time. So thank you, Diego. So now I would like to introduce Nicoletta Zapile. She's joining us from UPR Info, who are a civil society organisation based in Geneva, and they really have a huge amount of expertise in the UPR, the processes, how to participate, what's effective. So Nicoletta joined UPR Info in July 2018 as a programme manager. Before she worked at UPR, she worked at the International Commission of Jurists, so first as development officer and then as project officer for the Global Redress and Accountability Initiative for Gross Human Rights Violations. So she comes to us with a huge amount of knowledge and experience, and she is going to give us a presentation about how we can participate in the UPR and why that is important. Thank you so much, Nicoletta.
Thank you very much, Chloe, and thank you, everybody. I'm very happy to be here today. I hope that you can see on the screen the presentation that I hope will facilitate a bit to go through more in details some of the technicalities of the Universal Periodic Review mechanism that at first sight can seem something very distant from our common lives, but actually we will see throughout the presentation, and I hope also during the discussions and the question and answer sessions, how actually this mechanism can be very close to the citizens and to the people. Just really few sentences just to contextualize a bit UPR Info's work. So the organization was established in 2008 when the mechanism was born, and its main objective is really to provide support to all the different actors that can be civil society, so members of other NGOs, scholars, media, but also states who are involved or can be involved in the UPR mechanism. So through our activities of capacity building or providing tools such as UPR Info's database of recommendations, and we will see that maybe later on, we try to help your engagement in this human rights mechanism. I just want to recall a few keywords that Diego mentioned in his presentation that are very important to understand really why are we going to be engaged in this mechanism, why we should be engaging. One that I really want to highlight is the universality of the UPR mechanism. Why? Because the universality is quite an interesting aspect because it refers to two, let's say, aspects. One, it's the geographical universality. That means that through this mechanism, all the states are put to the same level. They all go through the same procedures in order to have their human rights situation monitored and assessed. So this is already something quite revolutionary and different from the other mechanisms that can review the obligations only of the states that, for example, have ratified a certain treaty. But the universality is also interesting because it allows us to cover a whole wide range of human rights issues. So this means that through this mechanism, we can bring up issues that are linked to civil and political rights, to freedoms like freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of opinion, but also rights to education, rights to housing, rights to water. So all also the human rights links to economic, social, and cultural rights. All those rights that concern the life of everyone. All of this because the objective of this mechanism, of this review that Diego has defined at the beginning as a state review, as a peer review among states, is made to improve the human rights situation on the ground. But this review, like this real exam that happens to all the state in a regular way, has its own sources of information that are given by three main documents. The first document is a national report. That is a report that the government does does a sort of self-assessment of how it has been compiling or respecting human rights. But this information, as you might assume, could be perceived differently by other national stakeholders. That's why in the mechanism, there is also the possibility to receive information on the same country by other two sources of information: the UN agencies and the civil society. That means all the actors that are part of the civil society. That can be NGOs members, volunteers, it can be trade unions, it can be groups of students, group of academics that are working or contributing to protect or promote human rights in one country. So on the basis of these three reports that are prepared and submitted in advance of the exam of your country, these three reports are the basis of the review. This means that during the exam, UK will receive recommendations, will receive questions that will be extracted by the reports that have been submitted in advance. Another key word that I would like to highlight from Diego's presentation is the word process, and it's really describes clearly this mechanism. Because it's true that one of the key moments of the UPR is the moment of the exam, the moment in which UK will be presenting the situation in its own country, and when UK will receive recommendations and questions from the other countries. But this is not the only key element in the process. As UPR Info, we have identified 3 phases: a preparation phase in advance of the review, the moment of the review, that means the real exam that usually takes place in Geneva, and just lately due to COVID-19 restrictions has been conducted virtually, but otherwise there is a national delegation of the state being reviewed coming to Geneva and presenting its report in front of the other diplomats of the other countries. And then there is an implementation phase. That means what happens once that those recommendations have been issued during the exams, what are the commitments that the country will take in front of its own citizens. That means what are the recommendations that will be then implemented by the country. And in these 3 phases, civil society can always play a role. Even if the review, it's a state review, that means that only states can take the floor and make recommendations and ask questions. But we will see in the following slides how civil society can contribute throughout the different phases that I have just highlighted. The ones that concern you probably the most in this period, but I would like to anyways keep the attention high also in the other phases, is the preparation for the review, because now we are slowly getting closer to the review of your country. In this phase, it can be really relevant for civil society to provide information about the human rights situation in your country. That means to provide information on how, if people have access to the basic rights, if the basic freedoms are actually respected. And this is why it's important to have consultations among the different organizations, the different NGOs or groups that work in this area, and to have also consultations between different actors. That means that it could be interesting to have consultations with, as we're doing today, the national human rights institutions and the civil society organizations, but also why not having consultations with parliamentarians that bring, for example, human rights issue in the parliamentary debate. So it's important to have these consultations to have an overview of the human rights situation in your country or in your region, and to take the information and bring those inputs within a report that, as we have seen before, will be one of the main sources of information upon which the review of your country will be based on. Of course, the preparation of a report is not the only input that you can give. It's actually very, it actually has a much more impact to complement the efforts that you have made in drafting a report by accompanying activities of advocacy. That means by raising awareness on the results, on the findings that you have included in these reports. The stakeholders reports, that's the technical name that with which we identify the reports drafted by civil society organization, should have 3 main elements. within these reports. The first one is an assessment of how your country has implemented or not the recommendations received in the previous cycle, because your country has already been reviewed 3 times. The one that we are going to have in 2022 will be the 4th review. That means that it will be the 4th time that your country will be reviewed. So the first important element is to make an assessment of how the recommendations received in the previous review were or not implemented. What were the challenges, but also what was the progress. The second element is to provide an analysis of those challenges or those progress. You, as civil society organizations, are the ones that are well positioned, and you can give really relevant inputs on how the situation can improve, or what type of measures or policies or actions the government should take to improve a certain situation in your country. And the third other element is that you yourself can suggest actions for your government. Those suggestions can be picked up by the diplomats that will be present at the review of your country, and will make, upon those suggestions, those recommendations that you make, they will transfer those recommendations to your country. So this is a bit the preparatory phase. And then, of course, there is the phase of the review. That means when your country is actually being reviewed by the other countries, where you can still continue to raise awareness on and the attention of the media and of the rest of the population on the fact that your country is being reviewed, and on what issues, what are the critical issues on which your country should focus to improve the human rights situation in your country. And the third phase, that consists basically in a double role for civil society, a double role for all those who work in the third sector. That is to, on one side, monitor the level of implementation of those recommendations that your country has received. So try and keep an eye on whether those measures that were recommended were actually put in place. You are the eyes, the ears of the government to know if actually human rights situation is improving. And on the other side, you can also contribute to the implementation of those recommendations. That means that through your work, your daily work that you conduct with, for example, vulnerable groups, with children, with women, or with people with disability, you might contribute through your action to support the country in the implementation of those recommendations. This is just really an overview of all the people, of all, let's say, the categories, the actors that can have an engagement, that can play a role in the UPR. So as you see, we have civil society organizations that are NGOs or human rights defenders, but we have, of course, national human rights institutions, but also academia, parliamentarians, media, any type of association, feminist association, faith-based organizations, any type of minority groups, but also trade unions. All of these can provide inputs on how they would like to improve the human rights situation, and they can raise those inputs through the reports and through the advocacy work, in order that those recommendations that you made are then transferred here during the review of your country. So that's why, especially in this phase in advance of the review of your country, it's important to coordinate the efforts in order to strategize on what are the key priorities on which you would like your country to focus on the next 4 years and a half. Because always keep in mind that this process gets fed from the civil society and from the national inputs with human rights issues that are discussed at the international level here in Geneva. But then once those recommendations are made, once those recommendations are supported or maybe not supported by your country, then the country commits to those engagements, commits to those recommendations, and so they go back, let's say, at the national level for the implementation and for the follow-up of those recommendations. So it's important that in this space, let's say, we start well the work. It's important to coordinate among the different actors so that you can provide a complete overview of the key priorities you wish your country to focus on the next 4 years. And to do that, for example, meetings or sessions like the ones of today are extremely important because they put the basis for that cooperation for the future. And as I said, not only for the preparatory phase, but this cooperation and this coordination should also be kept, continued, or facilitated also for the phase of implementations. That means that once those issues that you raised, those concerns that you have raised are then transformed into recommendations and accepted by your government, then it's where, let's say, the work starts. Then it's when we all work together in order to make those suggestions a reality. One of the most usual questions that I receive when I do some training sessions or when I meet with human rights defenders, but also any other actor, is if actually the UPR works, if actually this mechanism is or not effective. It's true that the recommendations that are issued during this process are not legally binding. It's not like recommendations of a convention or articles of a convention or a treaty that your country has signed. So they're not legally binding, but they really can be effective if the coordination and the consultations and the work that can be done at the national levels continues also once the review is over. And this is a bit a schema to summarize a bit this effect, how the UPR, even if can be considered as something very distant from us because it takes place in Geneva, it's actually informed by the national level. So we get the inputs from the national level through the submission of the reports, through the advocacy work that you can conduct. And then we see how these recommendations go back at the national level once they are pronounced, once they are made by the diplomats. They go back at the national level because the states will be then reporting on those recommendations received. These on the screen are some general examples of latest changes that have occurred through also the contribution of the Universal Periodic Review. That means that these examples on the screen, that I will go and read very fastly, briefly, are things that civil society brought up in the reports. They supported with advocacy work. They were picked up, their suggestions were picked up by the diplomats that made recommendations during the review of their country, their specific country, and that then a change was actually made at the national level to implement those recommendations. For example, we see that in Indonesia, after recommendations made by women associations that were supporting especially victims of violence against women, there was an increase of, if I remember correctly, more than 300 integrated service centers that supported women and children that were victims of violence. Or, for example, the fact that same-sex unions were recognized legally in Switzerland, in Angola, and Costa Rica, thanks to the efforts of NGOs working on LGBTI rights that brought those concerns on the table. And those recommendations were accepted, and this legal, the change at the legal national framework was actually made also through UPR contributions. In many cases, for example, there are recommendations on the abolition of death penalty, because in some countries there is still the death penalty, like in Chad. Or, for example, in Kenya, we saw that following the advocacy work of NGOs working on sexual and reproductive health, there was an increase of women receiving prenatal care. Or, for example, of something that was for the first time brought up in the UPR, the creation, the introduction of a well-being budget in New Zealand to tackle discrimination against Indigenous people, especially regarding health and employment. Why did I brought these examples? They are very diverse. They're from all over the countries, really to show you that doesn't matter if you are a European country or a small island in the Pacific, but the UPR is a mechanism that treats through the same procedures all the states. So all the states are reviewed at the same time. And as you can see from these examples, you can address really a wide variety of human rights. So you can go and make recommendations at the normative level, so wanting to change a law, to amend a law to make it conform to international standards, but you can also provide inputs and recommendations to create policies as a well-being budget, or to create concrete actions as the establishment or the creation of centers for the protection of women victims of violence. And with this, I would like to, let's say, conclude this part and leave more the space for your questions. This is just a timeline to show you approximately where we are in the process for regarding the next review of UK, that for the moment is scheduled in October 2022. This means that we, as you can see now, in this period are in the moment of the national consultations, those consultations that you can have among the different NGOs, the different actors at the national human rights institutions in preparation of the report. And the deadline for the report has not been yet confirmed, but it will probably be in March 2022. So thank you, and I'm really happy to reply to any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Nicoletta. That was a really thorough overview of Universal Periodic Review and some of the opportunities and benefits that it can bring us. And particularly, I thought it was clear about the opportunity that it presents to highlight lots of different human rights issues which matter to us, and as well to use some of the recommendations to leverage change in our kind of policy and advocacy work. So that was really, really useful. And thanks also for talking through examples of when it's been really effective and it's worked. So thank you for that. Now we have quite some period of time now for people to ask both Nicoletta and Diego any questions that they might have. I can see some questions popping up in the question and answer section, so that's excellent. So if you want to just take a minute to reflect on any particular question that you have, and if you have it, pop it in the Q&A box, and we can ask Diego and Nicoletta to respond. And I'll just have a look at those initial ones. Okay, so Ella has a question. She says she missed the timeline at the end. When did you say the UK report would be?
So the official deadline for the submission of the report has not been established yet. So we are waiting the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights to publish the final deadline, but it will be around March 2022.
Okay, perfect. Because I know that there have been some delays, haven't they, because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Some of the reviews that were going to take place have not taken place, and therefore we're at a bit of a gap, aren't we?
Exactly. There is a session of the UPR that has slipped last April due to COVID-19 pandemic, and so there is a bit of delay in that sense.
So for anyone who's familiar with some of the treaty body work that sometimes doesn't happen when we're expecting it to, it's very similar. Okay, we've got another couple of questions that I'll just field here. So we've got a question from Lisa Borthwick from Shelter. And she says, in your opinion, do you think joint submissions from organisations or individual submissions from an organisation are more powerful?
So joint submission definitely have an added value because you present, let's say, one issue that is supported by more organizations. So that already at first sight, it gives the impression that it is a relevant issue that should be considered because you have more people and different organizations who are concerned by that human rights challenge, for example, or that might provide more detailed inputs because maybe in that joint submission you have volunteers, human rights defenders, NGO members that work in different cities or different regions, and so they can provide data, information coming from a more extensive, let's say, area. So definitely joint submissions are have that added value. Of course, they require a bit more time for the coordination because you have to coordinate between the different members then of the joint submission. So it requires a bit more of coordination, but definitely can bring an added value. This does not mean that individual submissions are not good. No, you have the choice according to your needs and also on the complexity of the situation to choose which one you prefer. There is one big difference between the two. It's about the word limit that you have available. The joint submission, if you are going to draft a joint submission, you have approximately 10 pages to define the human rights challenge on which you're working, to provide a more accurate assessment on the challenges and the progress that has been made, and to provide your inputs. When you are submitting an individual submission, that means only on behalf of one organization, the word limit that you have is much less. You have approximately 5 pages at your disposal to present the situation.
Okay, so it's worth thinking about perhaps doing a joint submission. Did you have a perspective on that as well, Diego?
Thank you, Chloe. Yeah, and totally agree. My point on that would be one of practicality, particularly for the Human Rights Council. Is much easier to have joint submissions and to look at them, so that practicality has an impact and effect on the submission that we do as either joint or individual, because for them it's much easier to read joint submissions and to summarize that and to do the work on that individual ones, particularly in countries like ours, which is a very participatory democracy, and there is a lot of documentation and evidence that they receive. So joint submissions are very much welcome.
Okay, so that's definitely something that's worth thinking about, even though there's a bit of additional complexity involved in doing that. Okay, I can see we've got 3 more questions. So we have a question from Simon Porter, and he says, can you give the headline previous UK recommendations and an idea of how well they've been implemented? And I think maybe if we go to you first, Diego, on that one.
Yes, I was saying that only, so there were around 200 recommendations, and only 40% of those recommendations were accepted by the UK, and the implementation is something that we are looking at. That what I could say is that the Scottish government probably focusing more in our terrain and land and area. The Scottish government took quite seriously the process of the UPR, and it prompted a response from the government. The minister, Angela Constance, produced a report in 2017, and as I said, she updated that response early this year. And the response focused particularly on 3 or 4 aspects. One was the incorporation. So that's some of the area that she responded to, and you can have a look at that response. It's available on the Scottish Government website. I will put the link here in a minute. So the issue of leadership in terms of incorporation that we know all now, it became this national task force. That's something that the Commission have requested to the government for a long time.
So that's the process of putting some of those international treaties into our domestic law, isn't it? So that they're enforceable, which obviously over the last couple of weeks we've had good progress on. Perfect. Sorry, Diego.
Yes, no. Please feel free to interrupt any minute. And so that's the first effective response that we have in terms of the UPR. The second point that they focused, the Scottish government, was on equality and the sustainable development goals. So there was a specific response to that, and it's for us as a collective human rights organizations to hold account and the government to what they're saying in that response. The third was the national performance framework. So the government, as probably you know, introduced a new indicator on human rights in the national performance framework. And then there were some issues, general issues around poverty, justice, attainment gap, and if I remember right, the Human Rights Act was the last point that they raised also. And we are now at the same situation, as you know. So at 2016 there were that risk of the repeal of the Human Rights Act, and the Scottish government reflected our recommendations and responded that they strongly opposed to that, and we are now 4 or 5 years later on the same situation, and the same risk is existing. So those are the issues that the Scottish government has addressed through the UPR.
That's a really helpful summary. Thanks, Diego. And Nicoletta, did you want to come in on that at all? Was there anything you wanted to pick up on?
I would just maybe wanted to take this question as an opportunity to share the UPR Info's database of recommendations, because that can be a useful tool for those who it's the first time they are engaging with the UPR, to have an idea of what were the recommendations that were previously received. We collect them by country, by state under review. So you will see that all the recommendations received by United Kingdom, they're not split at the federal or regional level. But I will share with you in the chat, after I show you the database, the link. But this would be the homepage, and then you can go on the tab recommendations. And you have basically I already selected in order to avoid internet connection problems, but you have cards that are appearing, and you can see on the right, you have a menu that you can use to filter your research, because we have all the UPR recommendations that have been issued from the beginning, so from 2008 up to now. So you can select your country. Here you have United Kingdom. You can type it in the box. You can select the third cycle, which is the latest cycle, the latest exam of the human rights situation in UK. And you can see apart the results in the main page with the cards, that every card has a recommendation, but you can see a summary on the right of what countries made those recommendations, but especially maybe something that could be interesting for you is to see what are the topics, the issues that were raised during the last review. So if you click on, for example, rights of the child, because you're working with children, you can see here appearing all those recommendations that are addressing that thematic. If you can also make cross research by just pushing the small little button here between and or, you can put it on and maybe see what are the recommendations on the rights of the children that are also targeting, for example, is addressing specifically the rights of migrants, refugees, or asylum seekers. And so you will have, as a result, those recommendations that address both child rights and especially children coming from migrants group or asylum seekers. Just very brief, let's say, show of UPR-Info database.
That's lovely. Thank you so much, Nicoletta. That looks like a really useful and powerful tool. And I'm assuming that also the other thing people can do is look at the countries that might have made recommendations about a particular issue before, because later on in the process, there is a process of advocacy with other states, isn't there, that can be helpful to see what those countries have looked at. So that's really useful. And, presumably we can go back and we can look at what some of the recommendations were and compare those to our kind of current policy context. So that would be really, really useful. Lovely. We've got another couple of questions, so I'll just go back in. So we've got a question from Lucy Mulvey. She says, is there anything we should be aware of and do if we are civil society organisations reporting on issues specific to Scotland, but the UPR is examining a report about the whole of the UK? And this is something that comes up in our kind of treaty monitoring as well, when we're looking at perhaps devolved policy issues. So do you have any advice, Diego and Nicoletta, about that situation?
Yes, I think that's a really good question, because as we know, the signatory to these treaties and to the UN is the UK and not Scotland. So it's quite a political balance that has to be exercised there. So what we do, and it is quite effective, and we've done it for a number of years, and I know many of the organizations here do, is to highlight why it's important to address Scottish government and Scotland as a separate entity that the UK. So the issue of devolution is not very clearly understood and at the UN level, and then there is confusion between devolution, federalisms, and other systems that, like Spain, where the regions have a greater autonomy than in other countries. So it is incredibly useful, starting by explaining why they should address Scotland in the issue of devolution. The fact that most of our policies are created by the Scottish Parliament rather than by the UK. And then I think that's the starting point of that question and that you just posed. And once you explain why that is in terms of law and policy, then you start raising the specific issues that are relevant for Scotland.
Okay, that's really helpful. Did you have any tips on that, Nicoletta, as well?
It's a very interesting question that I also had a discussion with civil society in Canada, and they also have a federal state. And one of the things, they have the same problem or like challenge, let's say, that the recommendations are done at the central government. And one tip or like advice could be that, for example, when preparing a stakeholders report or in the advocacy work that is done to support it, and you have the opportunity to suggest recommendations and maybe formulate that recommendations taking into account the fact that there is an action that should be undertaken at the federal level or by certain region. So maybe, I don't know, use a formulation to say adapt also in the different region the alignment of the national legislations with this international convention. Just a few words really to indicate this, let's say, link, because it's not automatic. And so it's true that if it's not done, it makes the process a bit more difficult for the implementation and also to for the monitoring. So if we help them out by spelling this link out, maybe that could help out the situation.
Okay, so it's important to be explicit about sometimes when a policy might be devolved to Scotland as well. Okay, that's really helpful to know. We've got a couple more questions. So one from Ella, she says, that's great, thank you. I think that was in reference to her previous question. What was it you said would be due around October 2022? So I think I'm right in saying that what's happening in October 2022 is the kind of actual review of the UK by other states. And the deadline for March would be the point that we, as a national human rights institution or other civil society organisations, would need to put either our single reports in, or if we're doing a kind of joint one, that's the sort of deadline for that. So there's a sort of 6-month gap, isn't there, between those two things, and that enables the UN to kind of process all of that information and then all of the kind of related advocacy work to go on. So hopefully that's helpful, Ella. And we've got one more question, which is from Alan. And he says, how can this be more inclusive? I'm thinking of people whose first language isn't English, older people, and people who are kind of digitally excluded. That's a really good question, Alan. And we're going to probably have a bit of a chat about that after the break as well, in terms of how can we actually make this a more accessible and inclusive process. But any kind of initial thoughts, Diego and Nicoletta?
Maybe I start. Definitely, it's extremely important to be inclusive as possible, and also something that we stress quite constantly during the trainings that we do is to always keep an eye on actually how a certain action, a policy, a law affects differently different groups, different vulnerable groups. So always try to, when possible, provide, even when you're not talking, for example, directly or exclusively of women's rights or of people with disability, but also when you address other human rights issues more in general, as detention conditions, for example, see how certain conditions can have a different impact or effect on women or a person with disabilities or any type of minority group. So it's extremely important to have that reflex, and it's extremely important that those inputs are brought by civil society, because you have more the feeling of actually what are the current injustices or violations that occur, so that if you can spell those out in the reports and your advocacy work, it's extremely important. Then, of course, having, for example, consultations, that helps a lot to have the inputs of the different groups, so you can coordinate a bit. It's through this, in this period, as we said, that is made, or that it's where it's encouraged to have these national consultations.
Perfect. Okay. And as I say, we'll have a bit of a chat about actually how we can make the whole process maybe slightly less overwhelming for people after the break. So we should be able to do that. We've got another couple of questions. I'm just aware we've gone past our sort of proposed time where we were going to have a break. So what I'd suggest is if we take our 15-minute break, what I'll do is not close those questions down, so we can come back to them at our next kind of question session. And just want to sort of extend my thanks to you, Nicoletta, for that very, very helpful overview of UPR and for answering the questions that people have had so far. And we may get you back in for the next question session so that you can help us with that. And thanks also to Diego, who did such a good job of giving us an overview very quickly and telling us some of the specific things that we know are relevant in Scotland as well. So thank you both. And I'm going to propose that we return to the webinar at about 11:50, so in 15 minutes time, just to give everyone a time to have a stretch and a cup of tea and a bit of a break from looking at their screen. So we will see you back at 11:50. Thanks, everybody. So we've got some questions. If we could bring Nicoletta and Diego back into just the main screen as well, that would be excellent. So we can just respond to some of these questions. And then I'm just going to let whichever of you wants to answer the question first in. So we have, this is one of the questions from before the break. From Janice MacDonald at Deaf Scotland. So do we need to follow the written process, or can we be more inclusive and provide information in film with British Sign Language subtitles, audio or audio descriptions? So that's a kind of accessibility and inclusion question. Anybody want to take that?
Please start. Unfortunately, the technical guidance does not provide to support information other than written report. So yes, that's a limit. But there are ways where you can include, however, the inputs of people with disabilities, not only by organizing consultations, and so let's say taking the task of including those inputs in the report, and maybe you can draft as on behalf of these groups, but especially through the advocacy work, like really as Helen was saying, it's like states, the diplomats that make recommendations really have a thirst for information. They are diplomats. They are not experts in all the human rights issues. They are not experts in all the countries, but they do participate at most of the reviews. There's a super high level of participation of all the diplomats to each review. And so they really seek information through different methods, channels. And so if your advocacy work can, for example, you can create videos that you can show on YouTube channels, or you can share by email, like any other supportive document or like, method that you can use for your advocacy to support the information in the reports, that will pass the message.
Great. Thank you so much, Nicoletta. So let's look at the next question. So we've got one, I'm just going to do one from before the break because this person has been waiting. So it says, migration is reserved to the UK and central to Brexit. How can we mitigate the human rights issues facing migrants in Scotland given this tension? So a sort of similar question to the devolution question from before. So I don't know, maybe Diego, do you want to take that one to start with?
Yeah, and thanks for that. I think that's very important, and you're right. So asylum and immigration and citizenship is reserved to the UK government. But, and this is a big but, the Scottish government support the system. And you know, and there is different ways how they support it, from everything from housing to health, through the NHS to guardianship for services for children that are unaccompanied. So there is it's a big support from public authorities, Scottish public authorities. And the beauty of the UPR is that it's not about legally binding instrument. It's not about legally binding conventions and treaties. Therefore, you can raise those issues. You can raise those issues because the Scottish government, in fact, they are provide public services to asylums and refugees. And we raised that. So we, in the past, we separated the UPR in 7 themes, and one of the themes was about equality and gypsy travelers and refugees and immigrations. And the response that I mentioned to you in relation to the Scottish government in 2017 addressed those issues that we raised in relation to refugees, and they committed to, and that's a commitment that the Scottish government has for a while, on putting human rights at the heart of everything that they do. So that's a clear human rights commitment that it can be raised through the UPR, and that's a commitment that applies to refugee and asylum issues. So there is the window there, and they open that window, and they, as I said to you, they address that the issue of immigration in their report. So they were quite open and engaging on that issues, and they committed to welcome immigration and to review the new Scots policy, which is for immigration in relation to Scotland and the evolved issues, and the way they went beyond those issues, also calling the UK government and supporting our recommendation in terms of immigration detention. So immigration detentions, we call for a limit on immigration detention, and they supported that, a 28 days limit to immigration detention. And very important that children should not be held in immigration detention. That's something also that the government agree with us and responded in their UPR paper in 2017. So in fact, as you see, they are quite keen to engage on, well, maybe I don't know if the word is keen, but they are engaging on
they might do
on immigration in responding and those issues despite being reserved.
Okay, so we should use the fact that those are clear human rights issues in our report, whether or not there's a kind of devolved reserve context, and we should also use maybe the different approaches of governments towards these different issues. So that's really helpful. We've got questions coming in from left, right and centre now, so that is marvellous. We've got a question from Laura Pasternak, which I think will be relevant for all three of you. How do you choose, or how did you choose, which countries to lobby, and what were the levers for lobbying, especially if you're not an international civil society organisation? Thanks, Laura, for that question. Great. Any other thoughts from the panel on that?
Yeah, so we've done that together with the EHRC and Northern Ireland. So that's the coordination that I mentioned before. So this process of lobbying is posterior, is after you write your report and you know what you're going to ask the different governments. So you ideally lobby the 47 members, if you can, of the Human Rights Council, because they have a primary role on that peer review that we mentioned. But there is also a select group that is the Troika that Nicoletta mentioned, and then the group of countries that look at specifically to the UK. So once you identify those countries, you go for those countries and lobby those countries, and there are different ways to do it, and Helen and Nicoletta have talked about that, and we will talk about this again in our next session. So anything from going to their embassies in London, and we had a breakfast 4 years ago at the Commission, inviting all the consulates and lobbying there on behalf of the Commission in Scotland on those issues and the 7 papers that probably I mentioned to you, the briefing that we prepared for I'm just taking one that we prepared for them for lobbying the member states. So.
And we gave them croissants as well, Diego, which was that was pretty well received too.
The most influential part of the entire
it was the baking. Yeah. Absolutely. Okay.
So you can do that. You can go to you can do it through Geneva to the permanent missions, and you can do it by phone. So there are different ways. But then you target the countries that are reviewing the UK. You target the countries that are looking at the issues that you are interested in. That is the UPR info tool, which is incredibly helpful for that, and then you go for them. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, we've got a couple more questions. I'm just conscious of time, so we have we're going to hear from Mhairi from the Human Rights Consortium just momentarily. So if we could, today program style, do a kind of short answer to these ones. So Alex Thorburn has a question. He says he provides support to an organisation of disabled people in Uganda. Where can I access any UPR information on Uganda that would help me to assist the organisation to target their human rights work? It sounds, Alex, as if a good place to do that would be on the UPR info database. So Uganda would be in there, and you could take a look at some of the information there. And then we've got one last question from Simon Porter. So do the panelists have any tips and tricks for forming good coalitions and collaborations between civil society organisations? Any top tips that you have?
Yeah, maybe if in the next sessions, we can maybe spend a bit more time, but really briefly, when you do something like that, the first exercise, I think it's mapping all the subthematics and see the expertise of each organization part of the coalition, and definitely set up a structure in the sense to define the NGO, the person or the group of 3 people that will be coordinating the working group. And so then this will facilitate the process of collecting the information and the drafting process.
Okay, that's super. Thank you so much. And we will be having another session about Universal Periodic Review on the 12th of May. So we will obviously send you information around that. You're very welcome to join us, and we can focus in on some of these kind of perhaps more process issues that the detail is important to get right on as well. So that's fantastic. Thank you so much, Helen, for sharing your experiences with UPR, and thank you, Nicoletta and Diego, for coming back and answering some more questions. I just want to welcome our next speaker, who is Mhairi Snowden at the Human Rights Consortium Scotland. Mhairi and I are going to do a whistle-stop tour tag team kind of thing on some of our plans around including civil society organisations and rights holders within this conversation and discussion. And this is an area that people who are participating today have rightly pointed out. Actually, how can we do this? This is quite an overwhelming process, or maybe quite an inaccessible process for rights holders. So I'll hand over to you, Mhairi, and I'll just jump in as and when is required.
Grant. I'm quite aware of the time, so I'll be quick and less blethery than I normally am. I think I've met lots of you before, but for those who I haven't, the Human Rights Consortium is a network, a coalition, if you like, actually, of organisations of all shapes and sizes who want to see human rights better protected in Scotland. And actually part of, absolutely a big part of what we do is to make sure that there's a strong civil society voice, if you like, as a sort of loudspeaker to amplify that voice where it needs to be heard. So I think UPR, albeit it seems quite complex, and even the title of it is quite boring, is actually potentially quite exciting, because I think this is a way we can bring an international spotlight onto issues that are particularly difficult and lacking attention and action in Scotland. So I think that's where there's real potential for us to work really well together. And that means actually bringing the whole wealth of civil society voices together. So not just folks who have been involved in human rights debates on law and know all the techie stuff, but really starting from, not from the law and policy actually, but from people's experience on the ground. So what does it look like in terms of human rights on the ground in Scotland? Where are the gaps actually in terms of people's experience? So that's what we're hoping to look at in these next few months. We'll be working together with the Commission to really enable the whole range of voices. So if you're from an organisation who you're thinking we don't really have the capacity, or for whatever reason we're probably not going to make our own submission, then we are deliberately going to have opportunities to come together and discuss with others and bring your voice to those discussions to then influence both what the Commission put in their submission and what we'll be doing from the consortium. So those opportunities will be completely accessible. We're talking about just coming with your expertise and experience and bringing it to the discussion. But also for those who will be submitting themselves, then it's a chance actually that we can work together. So I came into post halfway through the UPR process the last time, and I missed some of today. So here's what I understand: that you need to put something clear in to get something clear out. And so that a lot of what we'll be doing is helping us to work together and discuss so that we can come up with clear messages to give to the Council in order to get clear recommendations out that we can use to get change. So practically speaking, what that will look like is, first of all, a series of discussions that will look at specific either issue areas or particular groups of rights holders, just so we can get into some of the detail. We will send out in advance plenty of information. We're not starting from scratch. There's already been loads of discussions. So we'll draw on, for example, SNAP 2, if you're involved in that, and all that came out of that. And we'll have kind of informal but really good discussion to look at what are some of the key gaps and priorities in Scotland, and particularly what do we want to tell the UN that they should recommend, and be really clear about that. And then also we'll have some overarching discussions as well that can look at the whole picture and make sure we don't miss out on things. The last time, I think really the council got partial information in and we got partial recommendations out. So we want to make sure that we have that sort of full picture, that we work together, that we can make it clear. And so we're focused really on this first stage in terms of those messages and the submissions. And then, of course, there'll be lots after that, as we've heard loads about today, all the other kind of ways you can use the process. So, Chloë, I don't know if you want to come in about other bits and other aspects.
That was absolutely smashing. Mhairi said that in about 4 minutes flat. Thank you very much indeed. And I suppose the other thing is to say that we're really keen that that's kind of quite a streamlined process for civil society organisations so that they can contribute at a single point if they don't have a lot of capacity to do that. So we'll be working not only with the Human Rights Consortium, the Commission ourselves, and also our sister NHRI, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, who obviously have an interest in some of the reserved aspects of some of this, and also the British Institute for Human Rights, who will be looking, who've got that kind of UK-wide view, which is so important, and they can kind of contextualise what's happening in Scotland a bit more as well. So we're really looking forward to that. And I think it's going to be really good, but we're keen that some of the gaps that were perhaps evident in the last UPR are not there this time, and so we can support people to participate in that. So keep an eye on the Commission's website for accessible information about that. Keep an eye on Human Rights Consortium's website and mailing lists for that too as well. You look like you would come back in there, Mhairi.
Yeah, no, just on a really practical note. So when we literally have dates set up for those discussions to sort of start, we will send them out, whether through the Commission or to our members. If you're not a member of the consortium, just a plug as an organisation, totally do join up, because it's free, it's light touch, and it's just a way to keep in touch and get involved. Yeah, but we will send you details, so don't worry, you won't miss them.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mhairi, and thanks for kind of coming in so quickly. So we've got about 1 more minute. I'm wondering if we can fit in all of the things that we need to do to close off the session. So the very last thing that I wanted to do was actually just do another quick poll of everybody, which I will try and start just now, which is really just to see kind of what your intentions are around whether you're going to get involved in this process. So I'll launch that just now. And I'll just read the question out. So now that you've learned more about the UPR, what do you think about getting involved? So we'll certainly put a report in. I need to have a little bit of a think about it and talk to colleagues, or I don't think it's for us. Oh, it's looking very positive so far. So most people think, oh, yes, I'll need to go and have a bit of a conversation with other people in my team, perhaps, and see whether this is going to be something that we can do. But a good 40% of you are also thinking about submitting a report, which is really fantastic. So please do stay in touch with us and with the consortium around that, because we'll be really interested to kind of hear your plans, and that's really exciting and very heartening to know. So there's 2 more jobs that I have to do before we close. So the first thing is just to say, as Diego mentioned, we are having another session. We'll be very lucky to get the expertise of Nicoletta again in that session, where we'll be thinking a little bit about report writing, those kinds of questions about coalition building, and some of the expertise that Helen talked about lobbying and etc. So we will have that session on the 12th of May. So keep an eye out on your inbox, and also the Commission's Twitter feed. We'll make that available. We'll make this recording available as well. So if you want to come back and revisit some of the parts that you weren't totally clear about, then please do that, and we'll tweet out once we've done that, once we've done the editing and made sure that we're all good on that front. So it just remains for me to say thank you so much to Diego, our Policy International Officer, to Nicoletta, who's the Programme Manager at UPR Info. It was really fascinating to have that input from you. Thank you so much, Helen, she stepped into the breach very, very last minute to talk about her experiences of UPR. And thank you, Mhairi, as well for summarising lots of that information. And I just want to extend a huge thanks to Stephen and to Elizabeth for doing our BSL interpreting, and also to Paula and to Mel, who have very, very patiently been closed captioning at the bottom of the screen throughout the whole event, and not an easy thing to close caption. So thank you all very much. And also Carolyn, our magnificent digital comms officer. She's behind the scenes. She's managing the whole thing and making it all go incredibly smoothly. So thank you, Carolyn, and thank you, Lauren, as well for setting everything up. It's a real pleasure to have been talking to everybody today. Take care, have a lovely lunch, and maybe you'll get to enjoy some sunshine this afternoon. See you later. Bye.